Installing SQL Server 2008. In this nugget, we're going to prepare for installing SQL Server by looking at the couple of prerequisites that you need to have on a computer before you start the installation. Then we'll actually run through a complete SQL Server installation, and when it's finished, we'll verify the installation by launching some of SQL Server's management tools. Now, there's not really that many prerequisites, and in fact, as we'll see, the SQL Server installation program will actually check these prerequisites and make sure they're there, and if necessary, it'll even install them. I like to have these things in place ahead of time, though, and the big one to have in place ahead of time is version 3.5, Service Pack 1, or higher of the Microsoft .NET framework. Now, probably the easiest place to just check and see if that's on there is to go to the Windows folder on your computer, look for Microsoft .NET, click on Framework, and see if you've got a v3.5 folder. Now, as you can see, I've got every version of the framework that's ever been made since then, but as long as you've got 3.5 or later, you need that 3.5 folder there, and then you're good to go. The only other thing to pay attention to is the edition of Windows that you're actually running on. If we look at my computer properties here, we can see that I'm running Windows Server Standard without Hyper-V. So the Standard edition of Windows Server really is designed to run the Standard edition of SQL Server. SQL Server Enterprise would go on Windows Server Enterprise, and SQL Server Web would usually go on Windows Server Web. And it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation, but that's kind of a good thing to remember. Each edition goes with the same edition of Windows Server. For example, you definitely cannot install SQL Server Enterprise on Windows Web. So that's the other thing. Once you've made sure you've got the right edition and you've made sure that you've got the framework, then we're ready to start installing. So let's start installing SQL Server 2008. Go to my computer, open up the installation media. Now, there's a couple of things that it's going to do as soon as you double click that. First of all, it's going to make sure that you've got version 3.5 or later of the Microsoft .NET framework, and it's going to make sure you've got version 4.5 or later of Windows Installer. Both of those are prerequisites that the setup program itself needs. So if you don't have those, it will go ahead and offer to install them for you. But after it does so, you'll have to reboot your computer and then manually relaunch the setup process yourself. It's not all automated. So once those are installed and ready to go, you're going to find yourself in the SQL Server Installation Center. Now, you're going to start off with a bunch of planning documents, and believe me, it's worth reading through these. Read the online release notes because that's the latest information. That actually pulls off the web, so you will need to be internet connected. If you intend to be upgrading an older SQL Server installation, run the Upgrade Advisor. That is going to analyze for a lot of potential upgrade problems and be able to fix a lot of them before you actually get into the installer. So once you've made sure that you have all the right requirements and the security documentation and everything else, go over here to the left, click on Installation, and you'll get your 4 installation options. Starting from the bottom, fourth option is to upgrade from a previous version. The next one up is to add a node to an existing failover cluster. Number 2 is creating a new failover cluster, and then number 1 is the one we're going to do, a new standalone installation or adding features to an existing installation of SQL Server. Now, a lot of these setup processes can take a little bit of time, so when I need to, I'll be pausing the recording so that you don't have to sit with me through all the progress bars. This first step usually goes pretty quickly, and that's the setup support rules. This is just making sure that there's enough on the computer to actually run SQL Server setup. I passed everything, so we'll click OK. And now we're actually going to get the SQL Server 2008 setup itself up and running. Before it can do that, it's actually got to install some support files for itself. These mainly consist of setup scripts and things like that. It's not going to modify any major portions of the operating system. It's also not going to need to reboot your computer, and usually, as you saw, it goes by pretty quickly. Once it's done, you can actually get into the main SQL Server setup side. So it's going to do a little check to make sure that nothing's wrong, and as you can see, I've got a couple warnings. One of them here is that I'm installing on a domain controller. Now, that's fine, you can do it, it's just not recommended, at least for a production environment. Now, we're in a lab, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it on the DC. Next is a Windows firewall warning, and all this is doing is reminding me that the firewall is enabled. So it's going to be my responsibility to make sure that the appropriate ports are open so that after setup is complete, other computers are able to contact this SQL Server. Here's a little tip. Before you do that to the firewall, make sure that your SQL Server installation has been completely patched. So that's kind of a good way to make sure that SQL Server stays protected until all of its latest patches have been installed. So go ahead and say OK to that. On the next screen is where you're going to select the product to install. Now, if you're specifying one of the free editions, either Enterprise Evaluation or SQL Server Express, you don't need a product key. If, however, you want to install one of the real editions, you will need a product key, and the product key itself will determine what edition of SQL Server gets installed. So, the obligatory license agreement, and then we're going to select the features that we want to install. Database Engine Services is really the core of SQL Server. That's the server itself. I'm going to install two sub-features, replication and full-text search. And I am going to install Analysis Services and Reporting Services, which are two other features that will be part of this instance of SQL Server. Now, these other features are shared across all the instances of SQL Server installed on this computer. Normally on a server, you might install, say, Integration Services, which we'll be looking at in a later nugget. On your client workstation, you might install Client Tools Connectivity, and here I'm going to go ahead and install the SQL Server Books Online and the full set of management tools. Now, because I've selected some instance features, I need to provide some basic instance configuration. This is the path where the instance will be installed, and we've already talked in a previous nugget about storage planning, so change that path as appropriate. This is the instance ID, and all this is really doing is extending that root path so that I can tell the difference between these. Because I'm installing the default instance, I'm going to say default for the instance ID. Now, the default instance is the one that users will connect to if all they specify is the server name. If you want to change that, you can also select the radio button for a named instance and supply the name of the instance. In that case, in order to connect to it, users will need to know the server name and the instance name that they're connecting to. So I'm going to hit next, and it looks like I did something bad. You see, the instance ID default is a reserved word, so I can't actually use that. So I'm just going to call this first instance instead and hit next. Okay, next up, looking at my disk cost, looks like I have enough disk space for everything, so we'll go ahead and move on. And the next tab is Server Configuration. We've already talked a little bit about security planning, so this is where you're going to pick the account names, provide the passwords, and select the startup types for the various services that SQL is going to be installing. Because we're here in a lab, I'm going to say use the same account for all of them, and I'm just going to have it use the system account. Now, because it's a system account, I don't need to provide a password. There are a couple of other shared ones down here that you shouldn't forget about. SQL Server Browser and SQL Server Full Text Filter Daemon Launcher. These are usually automatically configured to use the local system account, which is relatively low privilege. Also note that this is where I'm going to specify the collation order for this particular instance, both the database engine and analysis services. In general, you should not modify this unless you've got specific application or developer requirements that tell you to modify this. Most applications are designed to work with these defaults. When we're done, we'll hit next, and then we're going to do some specific configuration for the database engine itself. Rather than having it only accept Windows local and domain accounts, I'm going to put it into mixed mode, meaning it'll also accept SQL Server login accounts. Now, because I did that, it's going to automatically create an account called SA, that's the built-in system administrator account, and I need to provide a password for that because a blank password would be a really bad idea. I also need to specify at least one SQL Server administrator, and I'm just going to add my current user account. Now, under storage planning in a previous nugget, we talked about data directories, and let me kind of give you my philosophy on configuring this tab. I like to leave this tab at its default, even though these folders are not folders where I would ever put actual data files. That's because I want to kind of force myself to configure each database's file locations as I create each database. Now, the reason to change these is if you're going to have other people creating databases and you want to make sure you've got good defaults that are at least putting your databases, not on the system drive, as is the case here, then you might do that. Just remember that these are only the defaults. These can be overridden on a per database basis, and generally speaking, you're going to do that in production. I am going to enable File Stream for Transact SQL access and enable it for File I/O streaming access. It'll create a window share called MS SQL Server. Moving on to Analysis Services configuration, I need to specify an administrator, and again I'll add the current user and data directories, and again these are just the defaults, so I like to leave them as they are so that every time I create a new database I have to think about where I'm going to be putting those files. And we're also installing reporting services, so you've got really two choices here. You can decide not to make a decision, in other words just install but do not configure the report server, or you can decide to install it in native mode or SharePoint integrated mode. Now I don't have SharePoint, so I'm just going to go with native mode. Next, you'll configure your error and usage reporting. This determines whether or not Windows and SQL Server send error reports to Microsoft or your corporate error reporting server. And then the second checkbox determines whether feature usage data gets sent to Microsoft. That's kind of interesting information for Microsoft to have because it lets them know what parts of SQL Server you're using, what kind of hardware you're running on, and so forth, so that they can use that to improve future versions of SQL. Both will require internet connectivity unless the error reporting is going to a corporate reporting server. Okay, now that we've configured everything, SQL Server is going to do about 11 checks, and I passed them all, so I don't need to take any steps here. If you get any failures or warnings here, take care of them, figure them out, because going past this is kind of a one-time decision, and any failures mean you're probably going to run into a problem with the installation. Any warnings mean you might not run into any problems, but afterwards things might not work like you want. So having passed everything, we're ready to install. Here's sort of a quick summary of what it's going to do, and we are ready to go. Now this is going to take some time, so I'm going to pause the reporting, go get a cup of coffee, and we'll check back to verify the installation once it's finished. And so the installation has finished successfully. SQL Server will show you a checklist, let you know everything went okay. It does save a summary log. If there are any problems, that log is something you're definitely going to want to look at. But once you're successfully completed, you can start verifying the installation, and we'll start launching the tools, make sure everything works okay, and then we'll be able to start using SQL Server. Okay, the first thing I like to do to verify the installation is to go to my program files folder, or wherever I told SQL Server to install itself, and make sure it's actually there. So there's Microsoft SQL Server, version 10, and I've got all those same folders. Analysis, reporting services, and then SQL first instance. So I can go in here and looks like there's lots of files there, so that's definitely promising, but the real proof is launching the SQL Server Configuration Manager tool that should now be installed. And when that comes up, I should be able to see all of my SQL Server services, and they should all be running unless SQL Server Browser is stopped because it's set to start at system boot, and I haven't rebooted my system yet. SQL Server Agent is stopped because it's set to a manual startup mode. So that's all good. This is telling me that all the services are there, integration services, my full text daemon launcher, SQL Server itself, that's the database engine, analysis services, and reporting services are all up and running. Excellent. The next thing we can look at are the protocols. Now SQL Server has to use some kind of protocol to communicate with the world. The two that are enabled by default are shared memory, which is primarily designed to let other things running on this same computer talk to SQL Server without having to use the network. Named pipes is an older one. Usually, you don't necessarily see that used much anymore. TCP, that's the big one. TCP/IP is the one everybody's going to use across the network. Let's take a look at that. It's enabled, and it is set to listen to all IP addresses. In fact, if we look at the IP addresses tab, you can not only see the address it's listening to, this is an IPv6 address, here's an IPv4 address, but you can also see the TCP port that it's set up to listen to. So this one's set up to listen to port 1433, which is the default for the first instance. Alright, so that all looks good. If you want, you can look at the client configuration. That's something that you really don't use on a server much, but since I did install the client stuff on this machine, it does have the client protocols. Now the client by default does enable shared memory named pipes and TCP/IP. TCP/IP is the one you're typically going to use. Notice the order here. It's going to try to talk to SQL Server using shared memory, because if it happens to be running on the same machine and can use shared memory, that's more efficient than using IP. However, if it can't use shared memory, it'll go on to IP, and if it can't use that, it'll try named pipes, which is older. And the reason the client enables this by default is because older versions of SQL Server used named pipes by default, and so that way the client will be able to connect to them. You can turn that off if you know for a fact that it's not going to be used in your environment. Just cuts down on a potential security risk a little bit and shortens the order in which things work. All right, so now that we know everything's running, the ultimate test is to run SQL Server Management Studio. This is the all-in-one management tool. Now, when it comes up, the first thing you're going to have to do is authenticate. You've got two choices here. You could use SQL Server authentication. Now, if you remembered, I installed this in mixed mode, which means I can use either one of these authentication types. If I select SQL Server authentication, I do have to provide a logon, and I have to provide a password, and SQL Server itself will take care of authenticating me. But I did add my Windows account, administrator, as a SQL Server administrator during the installation. So I'm going to use Windows integrated authentication and just let it use the user that I'm currently logged on as to connect to the database engine. I could also connect to something other than that if I needed to, but we're just going to go ahead and fire in, see what happens. Okay, we are connected. That's excellent. I can start expanding and I can see all these different databases that are in there, the system databases, the reporting services databases, which show up as user databases. SQL Server Agent has the little X. We already saw that that wasn't running. If it was, I'd be able to work with jobs and alerts and operators and so forth. We can go into the security and we can look at the logons that are in here. SA is that one that we created. And you'll also notice that I've got all these built in. So Nugget Lab Administrator, that's my Windows account, and that's been added in here. Excellent. We can look at all the different server roles. For example, if I look at the server admin role, we can see that this is this has not got anyone in it, so I'm not going to worry about that one. So basically our installation looks like it's up and it's running and it's working perfectly, and we're ready to start administering SQL Server, looking at some configuration options, and really getting things going. In this nugget, we installed SQL Server 2008. We prepared for the installation by checking some simple prerequisites. We ran through the complete installation, including just about all the optional components of SQL Server, and we made sure that our installation was there by verifying it and launching the management tools. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.